Can. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak briefly on the Local Authority Housing Bill 2016, of course that was the sale of local authority housing, which is just come into operation. But this tenant incremental purchase scheme 2016, I don't really think the bill proposed today, the sale of local authority housing bill, is a major priority. What will it actually do, Lascancora, to address any of the problems with our broken housing system? Will it do anything to better the lives of housing or housing options for the thousands of people, 130,000 overall, I think, needing social housing, and the thousands who are in emergency accommodation and homeless? Clearly, there is a need for legislation in the area, in crucial legislation in this area, and I don't know whether the Minister has considered that in relation to the voluntary housing bodies. We were promised by a former Minister who's here with us, Deputy O'Sullivan, and her successor, that we would have a major piece of legislation on the administration of the voluntary housing bodies. We didn't have that, and perhaps Fianna Fáil could have taken this opportunity to come forward with such a bill today. The outlook, of course, continues to be very bleak for the people who are urgently seeking social housing. This very day, Lascancora, there were 1,078 homeless families on the last week of June, with 2,106 children experiencing homelessness. And of course, this is primarily a Dublin problem. It's something that we desperately need in this city and county, or 4 counties, and which the government, simply hasn't addressed. Now, I looked at the last few hours, like many of colleagues, at Rebuilding Ireland, and I mean, I'd say in general terms, obviously, it is a step forward that, at least in a comprehensive way, Minister Coveney has begun to look at the problems, but I think, Minister, it's frankly far too little and far too late. I mean, for example, if you take out your output figures, and I'm just looking at the submission I made to the Housing Committee on the 10th of May, which I subsequently, I think, sent on to yourself, where I was looking for expenditure, I think, of 10 billion. I thought that would be the kind of expenditure we needed to ramp up social housing, to address the real problems myself and other colleagues in this city deal with week in, week out. I asked you to declare a housing emergency, to go after the housing issue in a FEMPI-like manner. Now, you haven't done that. You haven't. You've mentioned the word emergency in various speeches and interviews and so on, but you haven't declared an emergency and said, let's go for it. The Labour Party yesterday produced a bill based on the Kenny report, which, of course, should have been brought forward. I commend you for doing that, Deputy O'Sullivan, for bringing it forward at long last. Now, you had 5 years, I have to say, to have brought that bill forward, to have done something drastic about the price of building land. I think all parties in this House recognised that the Kenny report was actually a solution to a huge part of the housing problem. And it has to be said, by the way, and Lascan, you'll appreciate that very much, that all during our lives, in fact, we always seem to have a housing crisis, don't we? There's always been a housing crisis, going back in the 60s and the 70s. When I began representing people in the 1980s, there was a housing crisis. We never had enough homes in the social housing area. Now, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, in their wisdom, and I notice how closely you're working together on this whole issue, and Deputy Cowan is saying, unless Deputy Coveney introduces such and such into the Rebuilding Ireland for budget time, this plan won't come into effect, because we'll all be out, campaigning in the general election. So it's this Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael government, which is now in place, or effective government which is in place. Both sides of the room have to be brought along. But the numbers just won't do very much, Minister, for the people that I represent week in, week out. I mean, you're saying 12,600 units output last year, up to 14,000 this year. This year is very, very disappointing, I have to say. 18,000 2017, then on to 22,000, and finally only in everything happens in 2019, 2020, doesn't it? It's going to be a great era, Lascan, when we hit 2020, because we'll finally be producing a very basic amount of housing in this country, the 2,500 units a month or whatever, which the last government signally failed to do. But basically, my fundamental criticism of the Rebuilding Ireland, and even in the legislation today, is that we're relying on the same old systems, the same old failed developers, the same old speculative finance model, the same old land systems. It's the same old, Minister. You may be doing it with a bit more brio than the last Minister, but you haven't come forward, I think, with something really innovative, which would solve the problem for those 2,000 children who tonight are in homeless accommodation and whom it will be tomorrow night and the following weeks, right down through 2017. You say, homeless hotel accommodation is going to be, fairly rare or whatever in 2017. But the reality is we have an emergency. You had the opportunity to come in here, like Minister Noonan did, like Minister Lenihan did, and say, this is a terrible crisis. We've got to act now. We've got to look after our homeless, our most vulnerable families. We've got to house them and go through X, Y and Z what needs to be done, with whatever is necessary in terms of changing the Constitution, may well be the case, bringing in the Labour bill that was introduced yesterday, those kind of measures, and basically getting into building again to the local authorities. It was yourselves, Minister, and Fianna Fáil, who, I think, stopped local authorities, discouraged them from direct build. And by the way, when you look at the figures in your report, this is my final point, you look at the figures in your report, isn't it deplorable that only about 10% of the output in those years at the Celtic Tiger, we were turning out 95,000 units, wanting to know how could we fill them, and only, 4,000 or 5,000 of those units were social. So, Minister, unfortunately on this occasion, I can only maybe give you a D+.
The Rural Independent Group has 9